if you grew up with that learned behavior of you have to work to earn your love, codependent, you have to, it's not unconditional, it's not just given to you. You're going to find a dynamic to reaffirm that.
Dr. Liz Fedrick is from Evolve Counseling in Arizona, and she has a powerful mission to share with you today on the narcissistic and codependent cycle. We dive deep into what level narcissists and codependents can show up in a functional relationship. We discuss the push and pull dynamic that attracts a narcissist and a codependent together by highlighting a book called The Human Magnet Syndrome. From there, we go into the shame and blame cycle, as well as the love bombing and devaluing cycle, which initiates that shame and blame. Dr. Fedrick describes that relationship as the uncomfortable comfort zone. It's our mission at the podcast to seek out experts across the country and world so that you guys have resources to reach out to when these things come up in your life. Did you catch Dr. Kristen Hicks' video on ghosting the other day? If not, head on over to one of her social media platforms on Instagram or Facebook to watch the full video now. And once you've completed watching that video, head on over to the centerforsharedinsight.com and book a complimentary consultation with Dr. Hick now. Without further delay, let's get into today's episode with Dr. Liz Fedrick. Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. It's about time that we bring up the conversation, narcissism and codependency. And I'm joined by my amazing guest, Liz Fedrick from Arizona. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much for joining me. I know that your time is valuable because you're juggling college classes and you have a practice down in Arizona. So I really value your time, and it's a necessary conversation for us to have today.
Well, yeah, and thank you so much for having me. I love following your feed online, and you always have such good insights and often making me laugh with your memes that you're posting. So it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, memes are a love language.
Absolutely.
And that Enneagram series that we went through last week was definitely outside my comfort zone, but I'm glad I did it.
Hey, I was super impressed. So you were just coming up with the prompts based on your knowledge of that?
Yep.
Yeah, that was impressive.
Thank you. Everything except for the type 1. The type 1 had a lot of the prompts were just like spot on, so I left them the way that they had it. But all the other 8 types, we had a good time with that.
Yeah, you were very creative and very accurate. So good job on that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's definitely not the topic we are going to start with today, but I think that the Enneagram is it's a very simple tool to help us kind of recognize what we see in other people, but also what other people see in us too. Right. And the reason why I bring that up is because the terms narcissism, codependency, and toxic just get thrown around in our modern dating culture. And that's why I bring on experts to the podcast to kind of help me clarify for our audience members. So that's where I'd like to start is if you could just define narcissism, codependency, and then we'll move forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, they are terms. So narcissism is certainly thrown around a lot more, I think, than codependency. We do hear codependency, but maybe not in the same way. It's not quite the same dig as calling someone a narcissist. And we hear that often, if they didn't get along, if something didn't go well, that is when I'm sitting in session, that is almost the number one label that gets thrown out there. And it is important to define what they are because quite frequently, what's going on is maybe narcissistic tendencies, but not actually diagnosable pathological narcissistic personality disorder. And so the difference being, or I guess the definitions of each, so narcissism in a pathological form, this is this person, and there's different types because there's the grandiose versus the depressive narcissist. So there are different types. So we're going to just kind of talk more towards the grandiose. And so this is the superiority complex, always has to be the smartest, the funniest, the biggest personality in the room. They often putting people down to make themselves feel better. There's a lot of mind control, a lot of manipulation. It's really important for them to be accepted and for their ego to be maintained. And so because of that, we see, and it's important also to separate out between the covert and the overt narcissist, because we see the overt narcissist a lot like in politics. That is, just very big personality, very controlling, often does not care who they crush on the way to the top. Where the more covert narcissist, we see this more actually in like helping professions. So we can see this public speakers, pastors, therapists. I mean, this is more like they are getting their esteem from other people, but it's more covert because it's like, well, I'm helping you, right? So that's kind of the difference with those. Codependency is an interesting, do you want to jump in? Sorry, I'll just keep rambling.
No, I really appreciate you taking the time to define narcissism, especially in the covert and overt. And what's going through my mind, why the Enneagram is so important to us, is that through the 9 levels of health, well, when you're talking about overt narcissism, that hits home for me because the challenger, the type 8, on their lowest levels of health have those tendencies. And that's why it's so important for us to be self-aware so that we can climb back up the ladder of mental health and really kind of dig ourselves out of that unhealthy phase that we go through. Everybody's going to hit their peaks and their valleys,
Right.
but being aware of it when we're in it is so important for us to help ourselves get out of it too.
Right. And I think, as your prompts pointed out on my type 3, I have plenty of my own narcissistic tendencies as well. I think it's really important to point out that, and we'll kind of get into this a bit later, but narcissism is really on a spectrum. And it actually is asserted that we should all have some bit of narcissism in us. Like there is, you and I sitting here doing a podcast together and believing that what we have to say is important enough for people to listen. We've got a little of that going on, right? But it's necessary to kind of take people to the next level.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm glad you brought it up from your own point of view, because literally in the type description on EnneagramInstitute.com, the unhealthiest version of an achiever type 3 has that word written into it, narcissistic tendencies. And what I've seen, maybe the tool being used as a weapon of like, oh, you're such a 3. And then like, I'm projecting onto you that, imagine that this is a partnership. I'm doing this to my partner.
Sure.
Oh, you're such a 3 and look at this level of health. You're so narcissistic. Or my ex was narcissistic because I'm familiar with the Enneagram. And that's definitely not the way that the tool is supposed to be used. But again, why we're bringing our experts on that we trust and that we've built relationships with to share those points of views with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the research suggests that how to tell the difference between someone who's truly a narcissist and pathologically, they're high on the scale of it versus not. Someone who is willing to really self-reflect and identify their narcissistic tendencies are likely not the pathological. So true pathological narcissists won't even give it a consideration. They won't even stop to think it might be a thing.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that as a tendency, as a typical narcissistic behavior, is they want no reflection from a mirror whatsoever.
Yeah. Yes. Because that would be scary.
Which is ultimately ironic. Which is ultimately ironic because isn't the fable or the the name actually from Narcissus, who stared at himself in a puddle of water and really got engulfed in his own reflection, which is like a true irony when it comes to your pathological definition of narcissism.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly where it comes from. And that truly that desire, so as he's staring himself in the puddle, that desire to be accepted, esteemed, approved of, that's the foundation of it.
Ironically enough, as well, like another point is that he's staring at his reflection and he's getting his value and self-esteem, from himself. That's like the almost like the true backlash of your narcissistic projection of yourself is giving you value.
Yes. Well, and that's, yeah, because it goes back to the ego, right? The ego is what it's all about. The ego is what drives it and what sustains it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Definitely. So now that we've kind of touched on the narcissistic tendencies and the pathological description of narcissism, let's touch on codependency really quick.
Okay, sure. So codependency is often thought of and can at times be the person that is overly dependent on somebody else. So we often think of this when I bring up the word codependent in session, the looks that I get back, shall I say the daggers that I get back of, excuse me, like, what are you implying? Because the societal definition or understanding of it is that these are very needy, weak-minded, whereas an actual definition of codependency is these are the caretakers. These are the people who are taking care of things, who are controlling things, they're keeping things in order. They are the ones who knock them down 10, they're gonna get up the 11th. Like, they are not quitters. They are going to continue obsessing and fighting and controlling until you love them back. So to call them weak is completely inaccurate, because in fact, those are some of the strongest people out there, because they'll take a punch and they're still gonna ask you to love them anyway. And so the codependency is more of, and I have to explain it in this way to my clients because I have a lot of high achiever codependents. And so they think like, no, my mom was codependent, or I saw that in my best friend or my ex, they needed me for everything. Well, in fact, you took care of them for everything. And so that is really where the codependency comes in, is these people are the caretakers, they're the controllers, and not usually the weak ones.
Mm-hmm. And are there versions of overt and covert in that personality type as well?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I haven't really thought of it from that way. I was listening to a podcast the other day and they were talking about the term, oh, I can't think of her name, who it was, but the term that they're using is like the high achieving codependent. Have you heard that term?
Are you talking about the Mark Gross podcast?
Yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I'd highly recommend it. Yeah.
I don't remember who he was interviewing, but she was talking about
Terry.
it from that.
Yeah, Terry.
Oh yes, Terry Cole.
Yeah.
Terry, yes. Thank you. That's exactly right. I thought that was pretty profound, because those are, I mean, I guess that's the difference between the overt and the covert, because the overt, we see it happening, they're the blatant enablers, where more the covert they are taking care of everyone, but this is not as obvious. They're just thinking, well, it's my job to take care of. And, we often see managerial roles, CEO positions, very high achieving positions. And so they think there's no way I could be codependent. Like, look at what I'm doing, but look at what you're doing. You're taking care of everyone.
Yeah. A man that's in my men's group, we connect on No More Mr. Nice Guy topics pretty much every other week as a small group. And he defined it that really resonated with me is, am I caring for my partner or am I caretaking for my partner?
Yeah.
I love that distinction.
That is good. Yep. And that's exactly it. And questioning your motivation is often, because even when we think of some or a lot of the controlling behaviors that come along with codependency, also checking in on that, like, am I trying to control my partner, or, where is this coming from? So there's self-reflection is crucial.
Yeah, totally agree with that. And you were telling me a little bit that there are similarities between the two types and sometimes hard to determine which is which.
Yeah. So that's fascinating that I've come across in a lot of my research, is that shame and lack of boundaries are these fundamental underpinnings of both. And so both the narcissist and the codependent are operating on shame and operating on this profound desire to be accepted, to be approved of, to be loved. And so that sometimes is hard to figure out when I'm sitting in session and I have somebody, we want it to be so cut and dry. You're the codependent, you're the narcissist, fix it, move on. But it's the behaviors and the tendencies are often really overlapping. And the other interesting part is that narcissists can also be codependent and are often usually very codependent. And so that overlap is kind of hard too, and which makes sense that they're codependent because they also are trying to control and manipulate. Because manipulation, it would be another similarity between the two. Both have learned to get their needs met through manipulation. So those would be the shame, the manipulation, the desire for approval and acceptance, and then the lack of boundaries. That's a rough one. And that is also a very common similarity.
And if I'm hearing you correctly throughout our topic so far is another similarity is they have a hard time looking at themselves from that lens of like, if they're sitting in a session with you and you're bringing up one or the other types, I could imagine that that person would have a hard time, whether they're narcissistic or codependent, to look at themselves in that situation.
Yes, I think one of the key differences of that is that the codependents, I can usually get them there within 10 minutes of the conversation. Narcissists, not so much. And so while you're right, has a lot to do with the societal implications and the stereotypes that hearing those words, like, you know, we started with it, they're just sound so toxic. And so narcissism, though, much more than codependency. And so that's a much harder pill to swallow.
And the context that I hear it in is that, oh, my ex was narcissistic and my ex was codependent. And in our modern dating culture, this can kind of perpetuate the toxicity that's out there that people complain about. Don't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. That labeling, because when it's not coming from a place of this is what's going on, how can we fix it so we can be better, but rather you're screwed up because you're a narcissist or you're screwed up because you're codependent, we are already operating out of shame. So that's not doing anything for us, but raising our defenses. And so you're completely right that it completely perpetuates that toxicity and dysfunction.
Yeah, I can feel that. And I guarantee you that somebody listening is feeling it in their heart and their core right now too. So we'll get to resolution and solutions at the very end of our conversation, guys. So don't turn away from this yet. And
yes, that's such a good point. Because when I get talking about it in session and I get these blank stares, like, so what you're telling me is like, we're destined for failure. Nope, that's not at all what I'm telling you. There are ways to fix it. There are ways to improve. Awareness, which is what we're providing right now, being the first step, there is hope to it. But and you have to be willing to hear it, right? That's the big thing.
Very true. Very true. I think that a key piece of a functioning relationship is open to influence in order to influence others as well.
Right. Absolutely.
And we were touching on it before we got off on our tangent there, encouraging people to stick with us, stay with us. The conversation isn't always going to be like deep and dark, but we touched on that blame shame cycle that is experienced in a relationship that's functioning off of narcissism and codependency. Can you walk me through the shame blame cycle?
Yeah. So that's kind of what we're talking about with the labeling part. Okay. So, especially let's say that frequently when a codependent brings to a narcissist something that they're not comfortable with, maybe it's the narcissist's relationship with another person, that maybe they're attracted to, or they bring to them something that was said, hurt their feelings, or was said in a whatever type of way, because the narcissist has a really hard time hearing that they could possibly do anything wrong. It becomes a blame back to the codependent. And so it becomes very quickly turned around, gaslighting, very overused term, but is applicable here. And that's gaslighting being defined as when somebody is challenging your reality. So something to be true and they're spinning it in a way to make you think you're crazy and you're basically start second guessing your complete reality. So that often happens and they blame it back. So let's just use like the flirting example. And so the narcissist throws it back with blaming. You're so insecure. You have such jealousy issues. You need to get that figured out. What is your problem? This is not about me. This is about you. Okay. So immediately the codependent goes into the shame cycle. They're like, you're right. What is wrong with me? I need to figure this out. But often they will figure it out, but then there's also that shame gets stirred up. So they're going to throw back the blame, right? And so then this is going to be, they're going to point out all of the flaws on that end, and it literally round and round it goes. No one actually getting anywhere because no one is actually being heard.
And it sounded like, thank you very much for that clarification. It sounded like in the very beginning of your description, you were talking about the codependent going to the narcissist and trying to set a boundary around the way that they made them feel or the way that they behaved.
Yeah. And that usually doesn't go so well, needless to say. Boundary setting, the hard part is that the codependent is often really willing to bend their boundaries. So the narcissist has no reason to believe that the codependent is actually going to uphold it. So they're like, we've been here before. I know exactly what to do. I know how to turn it around. And so boundary setting, hence the reason I was saying earlier, that's one of the key similarities is the lack of boundaries, because boundaries often don't even get set, but when they do, they're certainly not respected.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like the two types gravitate to each other because of that need that they need from each other. That codependency is the glue that holds them together. Would you say that that's accurate? That's true?
I would say that's completely accurate, and certainly something we should touch on because, so in the human magnet syndrome, Ross Rosenberg, I recommend that to so many of my clients. That's exactly what he talks about, is that attraction between the two. I like his description though, because the fact of the matter is he talks about how we're all really on a spectrum. Okay. So we're on this 1 to 5 for narcissism or 1 to 5 for codependency. And he talks about that when people are in maybe like the 1 or 2 of each, that's functional. Like, okay, not perfect, but none of us are. And that is fine. And that's functional. And there's an attraction there. And he talks about this magnetic pull between the two, because you're right, with these tendencies. So this often, which kind of we didn't touch on, so I'm just going to touch on real quick where they're coming from. So for a narcissist, this is often developed in childhood, needless to say, often emotional neglect. Okay, so the research indicates a couple different things. It indicates that it could be overindulgence, which certainly could be the case. So the child is just put on a pedestal. But even with overindulgence, the idea there is that the overindulgence is if the child performed. So if the child did something, hence the reason for that ego later on, they did something that the parent liked, then they got esteemed for it. And so that overindulgence is one option, but far more frequently what we see is the emotional neglect piece. And so the child is often disregarded, shamed for emotions, maybe no one's even around to shame them for the emotions. And so what that develops is I can only depend on myself. I'm alone in this world anyway. So anyone I seek out is going to be to meet my needs. Whereas the codependent, it's often developed also from that emotional neglect, but often the codependent grows up in a caretaking role. So they've been parentified. Maybe they were responsible for a parent's emotional needs or a sibling's emotional needs, but often also shamed for their emotions and often not really accepted. So when we get into adulthood and the codependent is like, please just accept me, like somebody just accept me, I don't care what I have to do. They're already used to being rejected, and the narcissist is already used to not having any emotional attachment anyway. This creates quite the push-pull dynamic that keeps them both hooked.
And it sounds really heavy. It sounds really hard. And it sounds a lot like the attachment theory that we love, absolutely love. So
yes.
That's
exactly
attachment styles being formed in childhood based on the source of your attachment, whether that be mother or father. And as you were talking about the human magnet being on a scale of 1 to 5, that we're on a spectrum, I could imagine that the children of narcissists or the children of codependents would not necessarily take on 100% of that personality trait, but they might actually take 1 to 2, like you were describing. Maybe they fall on that 1 to 2 instead of the 5, like their parent.
Right. Because a lot of this is learned behaviors. And so
Mm-hmm.
especially if you're raised by a codependent, you're very likely to also be codependent, and same for the narcissist. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, product of our environments.
Yeah, it's what we feel is familiar, but it's also how we were taught love is supposed to be like.
Yes, and that is where the magnetic pull comes from as well, because if you grew up with that learned behavior of you have to work to earn your love, codependent, you have to, it's not unconditional, it's not just given to you. You're going to find a dynamic to reaffirm that. We know when we're in it, this is horrible and uncomfortable and painful, but it's also what I know. It's also
Mm-hmm.
familiar and what I call the uncomfortable comfort zone.
Mm-hmm. Which I can imagine why that would help you get a codependent to that realization faster, like you were saying, within 10 minutes of the conversation, of like you're pointing out the uncomfortable comfort.
Yes, absolutely. And then pointing out, and there's a few key questions that I can ask pretty quickly about upbringing and their role in the home and their role in their family and their acceptance and love for mom and dad and so on and so forth, that we can get to the codependency pretty quickly through that.
Sounds like a handy trick.
I guess that's one way to look at it.
I'll rephrase. It sounds like a handy strategy to help your clients become more self-aware of where they come from and where they have an opportunity to grow.
Hey, Dave, either works for me. I'll take either.
While we're talking about it, those questions kind of lead us towards how could we spot red flags, maybe in the first 3 to 4 weeks or month or two of dating somebody new, because we don't necessarily want to project that onto somebody to perpetuate the toxicity that's in modern dating,
Yeah.
of like jumping to the conclusion, oh, well, he's behaving this way, got to be a narcissist, I'm going to tuck tail and run.
I think, again, going back to the odds of them having a narcissistic tendencies are probably really high, okay? Because especially that is not abnormal to have narcissistic tendencies. And so where it gets difficult is to weed out, are these tendencies, because pathological narcissism, there is a lack of empathy. There is an emotional void. There is not regret. There's not remorse. To call somebody that is really extreme, when often it's more of these tendencies. And so some of the red flags that you can look for right out the gate would be how they talk about themselves and how they talk about others. If you're in conversation and you ask a question and they answer and don't ask you one back, probably we can assume that they are. A good way to look at this is that narcissists are self-focused and codependents are other-focused. So if we're looking even at the red flags of the codependent, they will be the ones, they're going to ask you a million questions and don't even give you a chance to ask a question back, right? They're going to be completely consumed with you immediately. And so that's a good place to start at the initial. But then even when you're getting into conversation, if there's, and do you want the red flags kind of for both, or are you meaning specifically?
Let's start with one side,
other?
and then
Okay.
and then we've got the time to talk on the other too.
Okay. So the red flags for the narcissist, that would be it. First, being aware if they're not asking questions back, if they don't show interest in you, if you are always the one calling, if you're always the one texting, if you're always the one trying to set up plans, okay, this is probably a sign. Either A, they're just not interested, and that's probably something to be aware of too, but B, maybe they are interested and they're just very self-focused.
Mm-hmm.
But then once you start getting in relationship, gauging what conflict looks like is really important. If you bring to somebody something that makes you uncomfortable, or like you were saying earlier, if you're trying to take to somebody a boundary and they immediately disregard it, dismiss it, belittle it, run. Like, don't, like, there you go. If you are not fully already invested in this relationship, which if you are, there's other routes we could take. But if you're not, that's not going to end well for you, because anytime you take something emotional to them or something that makes you uncomfortable, you're not going to be heard or seen. And that makes for a pretty rough dynamic.
It also makes for a rough path to change behavior.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Because good luck getting them to change, right? And we see that because the codependents are the fixers. So that ties back into the narrative they're often trying to relive, that it was their job to fix as a child. So I see you as a project and I'm going to fix you.
Date people, not projects, right?
Yes, I love that. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly right.
It's one of my favorite poignant phrases when it comes to modern dating is
Yes.
date people, not projects.
I know, because it is so easy to see that. And, you know, I think another red flag is when you catch yourself justifying their behavior and making excuses for them, because we want to say, but look at all these great traits. Like I can get past that. I can help them change that. That's not what's going to happen.
And I totally agree. And that's not certainly exclusive to just these two pathological types that we're talking about. That could really just be giving somebody too much of the benefit of the doubt early on.
Sure.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
not even going as far as like labeling or continuing the toxicity of modern dating. Simply just like, oh, I feel like I'm making an excuse for their behavior because they're never available on a Friday or Saturday night, and I'll accept Sunday morning coffee every other week, you know?
Oh, yes, which we are going to get into that as we go through some steps, because yeah, that is right. The hard part is that often justifications and excuses are made without, it's often such a slippery slope, right? Like it's the snowball of it starts so small, and then all of a sudden you're making excuses for them being out till 2 a.m. without a phone call. Like it really does go to that.
Yeah, certainly the excuses that you make for other people's behavior in the beginning of a relationship will be the ultimate ending of the relationship later on down the road.
Well said. That's exactly right. Yeah. So some of the red flags then for the codependent is kind of like I was saying, like that their over involvement with you. The tendency to say, well, when I meet somebody, I'm just all in. I'm just like, I'm with them all the time. I'm all about them. Oh, okay, like maybe slow it down a little bit. That is usually a huge red flag for a codependent. The obsessive aspect as well. If just, you know, if they are constantly texting you, constantly, I hear lots of dating horror stories and sessions, and you know, I gave somebody my number and, you know, she texted me 5 times before I even had a chance to respond. You know, those type of things, like there's your red flag.
Now I want to enlist our listeners now that we're talking about it. Let's just say that one of our listeners has a friend who has this tendency to be like bragging about this new guy that they met within a week of meeting or after their first date. And it's not so much like once or twice in the 10 years you've had this friend. It's every single time. So how does our friend or our listener gently prompt the person who's always falling in and out of love over and over and over again, gently prompt them to take a look at that?
Well,
or bluntly, should we just, if we've been friends for 10 years, maybe let's just hammer home, like,
okay,
hey, do we see
much better bluntly, so my clients will tell you that.
Same here.
Yeah, I think that pointing out the patterns, we often engage in, you know, old habits die hard, and we often engage in behaviors that we are not even aware of are taking place. And so pointing out the pattern, providing facts over feelings. So versus the friend saying, I feel like, but rather, hey, have you noticed this is the pattern, this is the history. And it's hard to think of it from that perspective from the friend, because my mind immediately goes clinical of like, you know, the clinical based questions that I would ask of like, what is driving that? Where is that coming from? What are the insecurities? Not sure the friend is going to ask all those questions, but I think that pointing out the patterns would be a really good place to start. And then also pointing out the pattern of the outcome, right? So not just that you fall in love so quickly over and over, but also look how it continues to end.
And the same could be said from the other side of like, correct me if I'm wrong, but a typical trait of a narcissist is this term that's been thrown around, love bombing,
Yes.
where early on in the relationship, they want to say all the right things, do all the right things to kind of draw you in and have that gravitational magnetic pull towards them, so that they're not exposed for who they actually are.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's the love bombing, devaluing cycle. And so the love bombing comes on. I had a client recently tell me that the love bombing happened for over a year and a half before any other indication of other behaviors came out. And then the other behaviors were very scary. But that lasted for that long. Gifts and praise and compliments before the other side came out. And you're right. So that is often what is going on, is they're testing the water. They want to make sure that they have your buy-in. They want to make sure that you can esteem them back in the way they like. And when they realize, like, okay, all those tendencies, they are there for me to be able to control you, that's when it shifts. And it does not shift overnight, right? This is going to be the white lies first. It's going to be the little jabs first, until it spirals to what it becomes.
Like maybe the first time that they're truly exposed, and then they start that shame blame cycle.
Yeah. So often what will happen is these like white lies might happen, but the person on the other end of it has just been love bombed for however amount of time. So their perception of this individual is they are amazing and wonderful. So to even consider that maybe they lied to them couldn't even be a possibility. And so they let it go until it becomes, which it will, more and more overt. And so then what happens is then, yeah, the codependent will kind of push back. And so go back to our other example of, hey, I don't actually like it when you're out with your coworker till 2 a.m. And that is when then the narcissistic rage will come out of the blame shame cycle.
Yeah, I totally understand that. And that could be scary for somebody listening or somebody going through that right now. So why we bring experts on is so that you guys have resources to reach out to that you trust, that are objective observers of what's going on in your life.
Absolutely. Because it is so hard. When you get sucked in, it is so hard to see it for what it is.
And I kind of want a little bit more clarification. We've talked about toxic dating culture. There's an online component because we brought up the Enneagram cards from last week. And I'm not going to say that online dating perpetuates the narcissist and codependency, the magnetic pull. However, I do see some blatant, okay, in the prompts. Let's just use the prompts that I brought to light last week from Hinge. And one of those prompts is, I'll brag about you to my friends if, and what I don't want to perpetuate in our audience is like sifting through online dating profiles and pointing and saying that has to be a narcissistic tendency because the way that they're talking about themselves. Yeah. Because we have absolutely no idea who this person is, hiding behind their phone screen, just 140 characters, etc., on a dating app. So there's a certain amount of giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, but then there's also a certain amount of caution going into an experience like that. Some of our audience does online dating, others abhor it and they just don't choose it.
No, you're right. And I guess I would I support it from that angle, and I support it from the other, that also if you're given 140 characters and your response is full-blown narcissistic, like maybe we should take that for what it is. So
swipe left on that one.
So I completely hear what you're saying, and I agree, because especially with online dating, people are trying to be funny, right? They're trying to have a personality, and they're trying to make you laugh, and so they say stupid things. And so you're right, like some of it, it's just like, okay, are they just being funny or are they being serious? But I really suggest
do you want to stick around long enough to find out?
Yeah. Sometimes I'm wondering, just maybe move it along. That is that's the red flag, like put in your mailbox for you. So
totally. Yeah. And in those 140 characters, people are trying to sell themselves to you because it's online marketing for my dating life. Totally. That's what they think of it. And that's definitely how it's approached. And that's unfortunate that, well, fortunate and unfortunate. There's positives and negatives to every type of dating out there. But let's go one step further now that we're talking about online dating specifically. And it's in the question and answer. It's the banter back and forth in the first 10 messages back and forth. Okay, I feel like I'm initiating a lot of the questions, and I'm receiving a pretty decent descriptive answer back, but no question back. Again, we're not just going to label this person narcissistic, but we are going to be aware that that's not reciprocating behavior. Okay, do I want to stick around long enough to find out if this person's a narcissist or not?
Well, furthermore, regardless if they're a narcissist or not, do you want to be in a relationship where you are doing all the pursuing, that you are the only one, get home at the end of the day together? How was your day, babe? Great. Let me tell you all about it. Okay, see you later. I'm going to go check my phone now. Like, we don't want that anyway. You know, they could completely be a totally nice person. But if they're not also showing interest in your life, and you can see that within the first 10 sentences of exchange, that's, yeah, probably pretty telling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I love that distinction of like, how do we behave with another person, whether we met them through a friend setting us up, or met each other at the grocery store, or I've been walking around the city park for 2 years straight with my dog almost every day and haven't met anybody at the park yet, you know, struck up a conversation. It's just all these different avenues coming to us in modern dating that we can oftentimes get really confused about who it is that we're meeting.
Really confused and really quick to just judge, and like you're saying, like, narcissist, move on. It's almost like they're, decision fatigue, or, like there's just too many options, especially with online dating, constant messaging and all of that, that it becomes really hard to really invest enough in one person to see what else is there.
Yeah, I've heard of that. I've heard of that feeling a lot from our audience, which is ultimately funny because I've never shown up well on a dating app online. But the Instagram account that we connected through, that shows my personality pretty well. I think that maybe.
I agree.
Thank you very much. I do love the levity. I think the last 5 clients I spoke to when we opened up one-on-one coaching, they all really appreciated the levity that was brought to the Instagram account. But I think the distinction, I think the difference between one versus the other is how much content and how long I've been doing the Instagram account, and how much people can see of like, here's a history here. This is a person. This is somebody who doesn't take themselves so seriously.
Well, and I think you're right. I think the consistency of your posts certainly says something. I think the difference too being that, as you said a few minutes ago, online dating being the marketing, the dating marketing of themselves, whereas your Instagram, I know for me, I just saw your authentic self immediately. And so I think that is also a difference, is that there's this skeptic that when people are using online dating, that they're trying to weed through all that, right? They're like trying to pick it apart, trying to find the narcissism. Whereas if we're following each other on Instagram, like, this is just who I am, follow me or don't, but there's no other motive there.
Yeah, thank you very much for the feedback. I really appreciate it. I can understand that would sound like I was looking for a compliment, fishing for a compliment.
Is this your codependency coming out? Because
I certainly
did get a fishing for a compliment thing there.
I'm so glad to hear that. I'm poking fun at the narcissism coming out there, that you were saying that some narcissism is healthy, or it's present in all of us.
Yes, and healthy. You're right.
So I wanted the audience to hear that, and then also poke fun at it, because that's the thread that we are going down. But before I let you go, I would love to hear some resolutions and solutions for people who are experiencing this in their personal love life right now.
Sure. So I have a few steps I'm going to give you, but to start with, because I mean, you brought it up a couple times, that it just does seem really dark, and it seems just hopeless and scary. First things first, like I suggest the human magnet syndrome. I don't have stock in it, but I suggest it. I really do, because the insight that it brings. Codependence and narcissists, it's tendencies and it's all on the spectrum, and they are attracted to each other. Okay, so if you are the codependent, you are going to be attracted to narcissistic tendencies. That is the human magnet syndrome. That is okay. That is not the issue we're bringing up here. The issue that we're bringing up is when it becomes abusive, when it becomes pathological, when it becomes, I tell my clients, do whatever you want in life in general. Like, when they bring me things and they are like waiting for my judgment face that I don't have. And I'm like, you do you can do whatever you want. My only concern is if it impacts your mental health, then there's an issue. And so with that, if you have a narcissistic partner and you guys know it and you both acknowledge it and you're healthy and happy, go for it. That's not the problem. But the first part of this would be the awareness. And so this is just even being willing to look at it as either the codependent or somebody with narcissistic tendencies, the willingness to look at it, to reflect on your behaviors and is this damaging for you and the relationship? The other part of that I suggest to people is kind of like what you brought up about the friend giving feedback. If you have loved ones in your life giving you feedback on your partner, you might want to listen in. You don't have to make changes based on their feedback, and you don't even have to accept their feedback. But maybe just hear it out, right? Because when we get caught up in it and we can't see these behaviors that are happening right under our nose, our loved ones are often going to kind of say, like, hey, you might want to consider this. Yeah, so that would be the first thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, they might approach you in words like, hey, I don't know if this is the right fit for you. Have you looked at what happened last Friday when you came over for family dinner? And, the first time that I met your new partner, fill in the blank, that's probably how it starts, where they're bringing up the topic.
Yeah.
But I'm sure, go ahead.
Even more subtle questions like, hey, are you okay? Like, how are you doing? Mm-hmm. Things like that are even more that you're like, why are you asking? That when those start to happen, maybe kind of like listen in to why they're asking you that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And then you had some other points that you wanted to bring up.
Yes. So the second part would be to recognize your role. So what role do you have in this as either the person with the codependency tendencies or the narcissistic tendencies? Like, what is your role in that? And really being open to hear that. And then the third, back to what I was saying about, like, ultimately it's your choice, but then keeping that in mind. Like, your best friend doesn't want to hear about your narcissist boyfriend over and over and over when it's your choice to be with him over and over and over. And so, and I don't mean that in a judgment way. I mean that in the most empowering way possible, that ultimately you are choosing your partner. You are not stuck there. But then the second part of that is focusing on what's within your control. Okay, because your partner's behaviors are not within your control. The only thing that you can control is yourself. And so if you're choosing to be in this dynamic, you're also choosing the way you react to them. You're choosing to put yourself back in that position repeatedly, or you can choose to leave, but you're not powerless in it. And so I think that that's important for people to hear as well, that it is a choice.
I appreciate you saying that.
Okay, I have a couple more, but I'm like giving you let me know if you want to jump in, okay?
Oh, I'm all about listening.
Okay. Oh, such a good listener. I appreciate that. And then I think, if you decide that this is not the partner that you should be with, understanding that this magnetic pull we can describe to like a gambling addiction. So we can we think of it as like intermittent reward system. So if you think of a slot machine, like you put the coin in, you don't, and then you win big. And that's exactly what's happening in this dynamic as well, is that, it's like trying, it's pursuing, it's give me attention. And then when you get it, it's amazing. but you're constantly in that cycle. And so the same way that you're in the cycle when you're in the relationship, when you're trying to get out of it, think about it as an addict. There's going to be withdrawals, and there's going to be actual physiological manifestations of trying to remove yourself. And then the final step would just be, if you recognize that this is happening and you're making a choice to either be in it or not to be in it, get some help. Like, that is really, seek some guidance, seek some professional help of somebody who can really challenge it from different perspectives and really kind of help you to see your role and help you to see what is this trauma narrative that's coming up that's keeping you hooked.
Yeah, very well said. And I appreciate that advice. I think that that could go a long way for, even if just one or two people hear that from the podcast and they make a decision to reach out for some help. I think that that's the key piece of this conversation today, is that rather than self-assess and project these labels onto somebody else, let's seek out some really professional and objective help in determining and guiding you towards what you can do in your own life to resolve the anxiety and that uncomfortable comfort that you're living with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And being willing to get help to see what your piece of it is, and not just to point fingers at your ex the whole time in therapy.
I totally agree. Well, I know that your time is valuable, and I just want to say thank you again for spending the time with me. What do you say in the next 6 to 12 months we catch up and see where each other's at?
Absolutely. Yeah,
and
sounds good.
If your message resonates with our audience today, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
We can be found, our website is evolvecounselingaz.com, and we're also on Instagram at evolvecounselingaz.
Yeah, I'll be sharing your stuff because it's good.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me. This was fun.
Thank you so much, Liz. What an amazing conversation with Dr. Liz Fedrick from Arizona. I cannot thank her enough for coming in and sharing her expertise on narcissism and codependence, and hopefully you guys got a huge amount of value out of that conversation. If you'd like to dive a little bit deeper into what's going on for you personally right now and individually, come join our I Believe group virtual coaching program next Tuesday. Go ahead and hit me up with a direct message on Instagram, and I'll get you all the details. A few of the members have given us feedback over the last week. One person said it was a great group. Another person said that they could already feel their mind working, almost like overdrive, but in a good way, as this was her first experience in any type of group coaching like this. So your first week is free. Come join us at the I Believe virtual private group coaching program, where we're going to discuss how the Enneagram, your love languages, your attachment style all fit together in order to help you find your ideal relationship and partner. To sum up today's episode, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the golden rule, and that is treat others as you would like to be treated. Sounds awesome, right? Well, what I want to point out is that golden rule is an awesome rule to live by unless you're attaching an expectation to it. And the reason why I want to bring it up is because when you attach an expectation to the golden rule, like treat others as you would like to be treated, with a subheading that says, and I expect them to treat me that way, as opposed to just leading with grace. So what this develops in your subconscious and in your behavior is what's called a covert contract. And I think we've talked about this before on a couple of episodes. A covert contract is something that you have that's a binding agreement with a coworker, a friend, a family member, or your partner that says, if I do this, I will get that. For mindful people, it's easy not to get into a covert contract. It's pretty much, I can treat others as I would like to be treated. And if they don't treat me likewise in return, then I just move on and I find a better friend, or I find a better partner, or I find more distance and space from my family members if they can't treat me the way that I'm treating them. For unconscious people, like I used to be, I was oblivious to this. I was creating covert contracts left and right. I would get into a new relationship and I would cut off conversations with other people. And my expectation, my covert contract was that my new partner would do the same thing before we had that conversation. Now, another piece of the puzzle that I want you guys to think on for the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, is that if you have that expectation attached to this saying or this phrase in your mind, it almost feels like you're keeping score. Oh, I've done this many times of the dishes, or I've taken the trash out this many times, and my partner never does it nearly as many times as I do. Well, again, this is developing a covert contract in your conscious and unconscious mind, and it can really lead to a few things. It builds resentment in the person holding the covert contracts because their needs and expectations are not being met. And finally, unexpectedly, you might not know this, but it breaks down trust in the other person that you're in partnership with, whether that's a friend, family member, coworker, or your partner. It breaks down the trust in their subconscious. They kind of have an idea that you're hinting at something or that you're being a little passive aggressive about it. I've been here before. I know exactly what you guys are going through right now, whether you're on the receiving end of a covert contract or you're developing one yourself. I totally get it, guys. It's natural. It's a subconscious behavior. Give yourself some grace. But I wanted to bring that to the forefront now because of how the conversation around codependency went about with Dr. Fedrick today. We really hit on some key pieces of the puzzle to understand what level of the scale of codependency you're on, whether that's 1 through 5. And for mindful people, it's easy to identify that. For unconscious individuals, it's even harder. You might not know that you're developing covert contracts or holding expectations to something like the golden rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. A great mantra to live by, unless, of course, you're attaching expectation to the outcome. Again, guys, thank you so very much for tuning in to the Believe, Be Real, Be Bold podcast. If you love the message today with Dr. Liz Fedrick, don't hesitate to reach out to her, connect with her on Instagram, and share this with one person that you think would gain value from the conversation. And while you're at it, please head on over to your favorite podcast platform and leave us a 5-star review. That really helps us climb the rankings and helps our podcast reach more people. And I believe that a lot more people could benefit from the message that we shared today. Until next week, guys, this is Dave Glazer in Denver, Colorado, extending you a huge thank you for all the support over the last 5 seasons of the podcast.